Welcome to Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast, where we talk with the nation's top experts about today's toughest parenting challenges. Whether you're concerned about your child's development, learning, behavior, or you just want to make family time more enjoyable, we share the practical solutions and tools that can help.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Stefanie Boucher, and if you are raising a teen or preteen who is on the autism spectrum, or even a child who is approaching adolescence, you will not want to miss today's show. I am really excited to be here today with autism expert Andrew Schlegelmilch. Hopefully I said that right. Andrew is a clinical psychologist and the former head psychologist of Orion Academy, which is the nation's first college preparatory high school for children with ASD. He is also the author of the book Parenting ASD Teens, A Guide to Making It Up As You Go. And he is here to help us navigate some of the very real challenges that can come up for kids and their families during adolescence. Andrew, I'm so happy to have you here to chat with us today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. So, the teen years are generally pretty tricky for most families for many reasons that we're all pretty familiar with, I think. But they can be especially challenging for kids who are on the spectrum or who have any condition that requires extra support, really. Because this is a time in one's life where fitting in and operating on a similar fashion to one's peers often feels like it's of the utmost importance. And that's not easy for someone who isn't neurotypical or who has a disability. In terms of autism in particular, many of the hallmark traits of individuals on the spectrum can be felt quite acutely at this time. What are some of the biggest challenges you've noticed that kids face when they are teens who are on the spectrum?
This is an interesting question. I'm trying to think into my recent experience here because, as you know, it's a lot of different things to a lot of different people. A common issue that I hear, a common question that I hear, a common concern is parents are concerned with how their teenager on the spectrum is relating to their peers. And they're also concerned with how problems in social skills and social functioning affect their self-esteem. And is my kid developing properly or at the right pace, or are we doing it right, and that kind of thing. And perhaps that kind of leads to this great question that actually kind of led me to write the book originally is, what should we expect from our kid? What should we expect from our kid on the spectrum? And the answer is it really does depend. And there aren't any parenting books, or there weren't, like there's no Dr. Spock book for, raising kids on the spectrum. So you gotta kind of, as a parent, you need to be flexible. You need to consult a lot of resources. And it is also using a lot of instinct and common sense in raising these kids, and especially adolescents.
Yeah, let's talk about tantrums a little bit. I've heard this come up recently, so I wanted to address it. Tantrums are not uncommon, it seems, during the teen years. And I think that this may be a frustrating issue for some parents because it often feels like something that the child has maybe made some big strides on in the past. And maybe some lucky families have even left them behind, or mostly behind altogether. And then they tend to start up again, possibly during adolescence. And it can feel even harder this time around because the child is bigger. First of all, physically, they're bigger. And socially, people don't always expect tantrums from older children. So there's a social stigma there as well, I think, for parents. And why do you think tantrums tend to resurface during adolescence? And what should parents be thinking about when and if this occurs?
Well, it's funny because I think that course that you outlined, they're common or maybe more common in early childhood, and then they tend to taper off and go away and then come back in adolescence. I really do like to, when I hear that pattern, I like to ask parents, what was the course of it? And tell me the story about how these, because tantrums are this type of like explosive and big behavior tends to really rule the lives of the child and the parents and the family. And you get a lot of parents who kind of work around these tantrums and that kind of thing. So it's a big deal.
Yeah.
I like to find out, like, what did you do to help them go away or to have them be less of an issue? And a lot of times what I hear is that parents have made accommodations in how they parent, or things they talk about, or things they expose their child to, or expectations of the child. And it was really the parents' adjustment of the context and the surroundings and expectations, which helped the tantrums to decrease. And I call this the curse of the competent parent, that a lot of times these parents can really manage the environment to extremely high levels and high levels of control. And by doing so can a lot of times get the outcomes that they're looking for with no actual change in the child. And so in these cases, again, what we see is a kid is put into a new situation. And typically that transition from like junior high to high school or middle school to high school is really jarring. And it's around these big changes where you start to see these old behaviors come back. And the kid tantrum because it worked, because it helped them self-regulate or get what they wanted, or, communicate or whatever. And so they're going back to that place in the case of experiencing high stress. And I think a parent can feel like a lot of it is undone, but what is happening here is a lot of the structures and supports that the parent had put in place are just not as effective as they were. And so moving forward, it's talking about, well, how do we help manage the environment? But also, what can we expect from a kid now in self-management and self-regulation? And then we kind of get into the diagnostics and assessment piece and the therapeutic piece.
Yeah. We at Torchlight like to say that all behavior is communication.
Sure.
So, so I think that that's also an important thing for parents to keep in mind, is that, like you said, there's some need that's either being met by the tantrum, or they're communicating a shift that's taken place. And it's a signal really to make those adjustments that you mentioned.
Right. And you can also take it one step further to say we can anticipate a big change coming up. So what should we see, or what might we see? And I've had this conversation with families and with the child included, saying you're about to go into high school. And so what do we think we're going to see here? And it's amazing, just the high quality conversations we have and the level of insight that some of these kids can bring to the conversation of, I think I'm going to, be overwhelmed and start doing my sensory stuff, or have blow-ups, or be, more loud or angry, and I'll need more alone time, whatever. But I think parents get themselves into trouble when they say, my kid shouldn't be doing this, or they can't do this, and really limit what are the options for a child, as opposed to saying this is happening or this might happen, and so what are we going to do about it? And so think, again, more in the line of like control and agency and influence and all that stuff. And that too, you asked about or brought up self-esteem, just highlighting these situations for kids to be able to predict and anticipate and be in control. That really enhances the self-esteem piece.
Absolutely. Those are really good points. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about teens and social well-being. Obviously, social expectations and the rules get so much more complicated once, the elementary school years are over.
Right.
And in fact, studies show that many kids on the spectrum really begin to feel isolated around this time. In fact, I think you could argue that most kids feel isolated somewhat around this time. What are the biggest frustrations you tend to see that kids have socially, and are they the same fears that their parents have? So kind of what are the kids worried about in terms of their social life, and what are the parents worried about on behalf of their kids?
I think that's exactly how to separate out this question is what do kids worry about? What do parents worry about? And are they the same thing? And usually what I'll say is the prominent worries or concerns are usually not the same between parents and kids. Parents typically worry, and this is like broad strokes, generalizations. Does my kid have enough friends? And, they have this idea about what friendships are or what they should mean based on their own experience. And unless that parent is on the spectrum, parents in general have a hard time imagining what their kids are expecting from friendships or relationships. So I do get a lot of, my kid doesn't have any friends, doesn't want to go make friends, doesn't want to do stuff, and is isolated and spends a lot of time by himself or herself. And my answer to that is that's not necessarily pathological, but because, what types of peer interaction or friendships or social interactions people need to be healthy, it does vary by person, I found. And so, from the parent side, I say, okay, let's go ahead and talk with their kids about what they want, what they think is normal, what, are their expectations. And a lot of times expectations can drive the healthy piece. And even looking at expectations oftentimes gives us a chance to kind of do some intervention if any is needed. In adolescence, though, this is a time for a lot of kids on the spectrum that I've seen them become aware that they are being judged. And not judged in the critical sense, looked down upon, but judged in the sense of like people are watching your behavior and they notice your behavior, and they're using their observations to develop a reputation for you, and that you have control over what people think about you and how they think about you. And it's almost for some kids like a light switch that they become self-aware, or not self-aware is not it, but more like aware of the observation of others, aware of the judgments of others. And for a lot of kids, this can totally freak them out. And they realize they're being held to a standard, but they have no idea what that standard is. They realize that even just kind of rationally, kids my age are doing these behaviors like going to the mall or driving or whatever, and I'm not doing that. A lot of kids say, I have no drive or desire for that. And, what does that mean for me? So it's really varied, but for adolescents, a lot of times it starts with this realization that these are my people, these are my peers, they are watching me and other people are watching me, and I don't really know what to do with that information now.
Yeah, absolutely. How large a role should parents play in facilitating their child's social life, or can they even help facilitate their child's social life? Let's say that you have a child who does want to make some more meaningful connections. These are no longer the days where you can call up another parent and make a play date for your child. It's obviously more complicated and nuanced than that. Are there still things parents can do to help their children in this area?
Yeah, the word of hope and of life that I give to parents is that they can feel free to be as involved as they need to be. And I am perfectly fine with parents of high schoolers calling other parents of high schoolers and setting something up, especially if the other peer is on the spectrum or has an organizational or executive functioning deficit or those kinds of things. Getting together with somebody, just planning an outing or a time to hang out, or even connecting on the phone, it's an incredibly complex task. It takes relatively sophisticated executive functioning skills, intentionality, and then social skills to kind of guess, is this person even interested in spending time with me? And so, you want your hit rate for hangouts and requests to be high. Because a lot of kids on the spectrum are kind of off time learning social skills and, developing in that area, they can kind of miss it with their peers and be really behind by 3 to 5 years behind in the development of skills to make this happen. And so somebody's got to bridge that gap. And usually I think the best people to do it are the parents. So parents can get creative in how they do this. Like I said, as fundamental as calling the parent of the other kid and trying to facilitate that way. They can go through the act of your classmates or whatever. How are they connecting? And so typically maybe they're using social media or a text-based communication or something like that. And so facilitating that process. But I do encourage parents to be as involved as they feel they need to be with this eye toward how and where can I back off. And it's really not a hard and fast rule. It's not a timeline that I can write out for them, but I can kind of help them figure out when to know that they should expect that their kid can identify somebody at school that they want to become better friends with or hang out with, and then be able to or reasonably be expected to go ahead and initiate and follow through on that contact. It's again, these parents, their kid is off time. There's no book that's really going to direct them through this process or great resource. And so they got to kind of feel it out and really collaborate and partner with their child to move towards success.
That's great advice. Thank you. Well, it wouldn't be a conversation about adolescence if we didn't touch on the topics of both puberty and human sexuality. What do parents need to be teaching their child about their bodies and about their sexuality? How might these conversations differ from the ones they would have with their neurotypical children?
Okay. I think that's, you remember to ask me that the second part of that question after I get distracted with the first part. I have little kids, and I am just amazed at the quality of information out there for even toddlers to learn about sexuality and physiology and human development and those kinds of things. And it's done in a very kind of respectful, non-sensationalized way. And so I am just a firm believer in let's go ahead and start young and give information to kids that they can understand and keep this discussion going. I really think that the days of sitting down with your kid on their 13th birthday and having the birds and the bees talk, it's over. I do think that a lot of parents are just hoping that this is the truth, that I can just wait as long as humanly possible and, then have that discussion with them. And it's not going to work anymore. The big reason for this, well, there's two big reasons. The one is that we have wonderful, fantastic, great materials to help parents of children of all ages and all learning styles to access this information in an understandable way. The other is just the internet. And it takes about 2 seconds for a kid to learn, a ton of bad information about sexuality and relationship. And so if parents aren't out in front of this, their kid is going to get this information from somewhere else. And I want parents to be the primary resource for their kids on sex and sexuality and relationships and puberty for as long as humanly possible, because the internet is not looking out for your child. So that's my pitch. When and by what means and those kinds of things, it's as soon as possible and using the best materials you have.
Right. So the second part of that question was, are there ways in which the conversations would differ from the ones one might have with their neurotypical children?
Yes. And this is based on personal experience and not necessarily research. But this is the good news for parents of kids on the spectrum. I think pretty much all parents feel some trepidation about talking about sex with their kids. And I have never had a more straightforward, kind of informational sex talk. I've had this talk with lots of kids over the years, in practice and in teaching and those kinds. It's never been easier than talking with kids on the spectrum.
Well, that was actually my next question, was that is it actually easier because it's so straightforward and informational for some kids?
And you gotta try it out to believe me, but it really is quite straightforward. I think I wrote in the book, I used to teach sex ed to kids on the spectrum, high schoolers, and for, meeting California standards. And it's fascinating. There aren't a whole lot of embarrassed looks or, those kinds of things. And the questions are extremely practical and specific. And I'm not going to say it's a great experience, but it's certainly easier than I expected it would be.
Yeah, I think the lack of embarrassment component is key, because that's one of the reasons it's tough for parents to have those conversations with their kids, is because you get the eye rolls and you get, all those nonverbal communication cues that say, Mom, Dad, I don't want to have this conversation with you right now.
And then I talk with a lot of parents who are worried that then the kid is going to start to ask them about their own sexual history or accuse them of, why won't you let me and my boyfriend do this when you and Dad were, But that kind of stuff really doesn't happen. Maybe it does, but I haven't had that information be turned back around on me or used or weaponized against me or anything like that. So it's a kind of a practical, straightforward discussion usually.
That's interesting. So I know very few parents who love the idea of their teenagers dating, but for most of us, it's inevitable at some point.
Right.
What tips might you offer to parents of children who would like to begin dating or who have someone they have a crush on or whom they're interested in?
Yeah. I think the best thing to do is, again, to have that conversation with your kid. What do you think is going to happen here? What are you expecting? Or how is this going to go? Or what are your plans? Or those kinds of things. I think kids in general have bizarre ideas about what dating is. And, we foster this. We let them watch TV and we produce movies and programming and that kind of thing, which gives a very kind of like these are, we only tell the extreme stories. We only tell the sensationalized stories, for better or for worse, when much of our experience is actually quite mundane. So it's good to figure out what your child expects and how they think that this is going to go. And I do talk to my clients and students on the spectrum, and I say very frankly and openly, this is the hardest relationship you're ever going to have in your life. It is, in many respects, it can be the most rewarding, but technically speaking, this is the hardest one to do. And you need to be ready for this. And so with kids on the spectrum, I will go ahead and set some developmental milestones. And I tell parents this, I would be uncomfortable with my child dating if they didn't first already have a couple of good friends. And the reason that a lot of kids, they want to date, but they don't want to have friends is because having friends is a lot of work, which it is. To prove that you're ready for a romantic relationship, you need to go ahead and have a friend. And by friendship, I mean somebody that you get together with regularly outside of school and you talk on the phone with or text with or whatever. But you need to do the task of building a friendship to demonstrate that you are ready to move on to this more complicated and challenging girlfriend-boyfriend type relationship.
Yeah, that is incredibly sensible. I've never heard someone say it that way, but that's completely true. I love that. Children and teens with ASD and other disabilities can be particularly vulnerable, as we know, to cyberbullying, bullying, or even assault, especially given, potential difficulties with nonverbal communication. What are the real risks here, and what should parents be doing to keep their child safe?
Yeah, I think one of the main risks is the unlimited access to the internet and all that the internet has to offer. I think I heard a previous podcast where you were discussing with one of your guests about boundaries and privacy issues between parents and teenagers and how do parents kind of manage that, giving their kid privacy and all that. And this is a big thing. I think privacy, and this is, again, maybe I'll get some letters on this one. I think access to privacy is earned. And I meet a lot of families where privacy is granted as something like an inalienable right of a child. And I think that there's some truth to that, but privacy and this kind of hands off, let them do whatever they're going to do. And where do I draw the line? It's a really tricky thing, especially with the internet, because the risks are so high. I think that this is an area that privacy really does need to be earned and demonstrated that you can handle independence or you can handle privacy online. So I'm a big fan of if a kid wants to have some sort of social media account, which I think is great. I think that this is how people are communicating these days, and it's a useful tool for socializing and for vocation. I think the parent should let them have it, but I think the parent needs to have access to that account at all times for at least the initial interactions. And they need to let their kid know, I'm going to be checking in on this. And I'm going to be looking at how you interact with people online. Interestingly, what comes up is, and I'm not making this up, a lot of the kids on the spectrum are the ones actually engaging in the so-called cyberbullying or trolling or otherwise saying inflammatory things online. And I don't think it's because this population is particularly, sociopathic or anything like that. I think it's because it's kind of a misunderstanding of the effect of their presence online, because there's such a disconnect between what I put on screen and then who reads it and what it does to them and how it makes them feel. It's really easy to kind of speak your mind and all your opinions and to not censor, and in some cases to be pretty aggressive when people disagree with you or say that you're being offensive and that kind of thing. So I think that cyberbullying does go on, and people on the spectrum with limited social skills and nonverbal communication issues can be victimized quite a bit. But the inverse, I think, is also possible, and it's something that parents and kids need to be aware of, and then, of course, talking about these interactions is actually, one of the reasons therapeutically that I like kids to be online is because everything is recorded and there's a manuscript for everything that's done. And I love it when kids bring in conversations to me and we talk through, and we use this as a tool to figure out, wow, what went wrong? How could I have done this differently? What was I hoping would happen? That kind of thing. So a lot of material here for parents and professionals and kids really to work with.
Absolutely. Any words on the more in-person bullying or risks there?
I think this is a thing that has been changing over time. I have to admit, I live in a bubble over here. I'm in San Francisco, and we're at the center of the liberal social movements. And, there's a lot of acceptance and openness here of diverse lifestyles and opinions and all that stuff. So I'm wondering if I see it as much as it's happening elsewhere in the country and perhaps the world. I do think that kids on the spectrum, teenagers, and even young adults tend to be a little bit naive. And so I think it's okay to, again, check in and say, what do you expect is going to happen? And let's talk about best practices. I do talk with younger kids about how to access support and ask for help. Who do you ask for directions? Who do you ask to use their phone? Because you do get a lot of indiscriminate questioning. I saw somebody on the bus taking a group of students somewhere who are on the spectrum, and there's a lot of indiscriminate asking of strangers information, like, where am I? What's the next stop? And kind of helping to form that behavior to say there are people in society who are like police or security officers or, bus drivers who are part of their job is to help make sure I'm safe and that kind of thing. So accessing appropriate supports. But then, you get into the more of the peer-based bullying and, discrimination and that kind of thing. And the question comes up, when can a child be expected to handle the interaction by themselves, and when do they need help? And so what's the difference between self-advocacy and tattling? And this is a big discussion I have with a lot of my families is, how do you know, or how can you know when a child needs help? And when they need help, are they going to come and ask you for it? And are they going to advocate for themselves? And then when can they really handle a situation, or should they should be able to handle a situation on their own? And so again, this comes down to the individual and their environment and their particular skill set.
Right. And those are definitely really important distinctions to make.
Mm-hmm.
I think the final thing that I wanted to touch upon is the fact that, many kids with disabilities tend to be a little bit more at risk for certain mental health issues like anxiety or depression. Mm-hmm. How does a parent tell the difference between what could be a typical level of teen angst versus something that needs more attention?
Right. And I'll just, my disclaimer here is it's really hard. And
yeah, I think so.
It's really hard. And the other disclaimer is you're probably wrong. So I think because, we used to think that kids on the spectrum were more, at lower risk for suicide and, drug and alcohol dependence and those kinds of things. And it's just that the research hasn't borne that out. So we need to take very seriously mental health issues among teenagers and adolescents in general, but also specifically in the spectrum population. So, I could go into how I figure it out, but I would encourage parents to take this very seriously, to investigate. It's not always the case. Like, for instance, a lot of the questions that I get is, my kid is spending more and more time by himself and I'm worried he's depressed, or he has low self-esteem and I'm worried he's depressed, and those kinds of things. We cannot, professionals can't use the same method for evaluating mental health in the spectrum population as they can in the typical population, because a lot of that stuff is based on self-report. It's a communication piece. I'm talking about, or I'm expressing how I feel inside. And we know that this is part of the disability, is that nonverbal communication issues, not just the receptive end, but the expressive end, can come out looking differently than it's intended. So we've got expressive language issues, both nonverbal and verbal. And so you have to kind of really pick this apart and to figure out what's going on. Isolation does not necessarily mean depression in the way that it would in a typical population. Isolation could actually be a form of healthy coping, because maybe the day was so crazy that I need to kind of reboot my brain before I get into my homework or something like that. So you'll have kids who do just need to be quiet, or listen to music for a couple of hours so that they can get back to doing what they need to be doing. I think depression in the spectrum population is real, and I encourage parents to look for changes in behavior, more or less sleep, increased or decreased appetite, increased or decreased preferences for socialization, but really to be looking for changes. And then if you're starting to see some concerning changes, then you need to check in with a professional who has some experience dealing with this. Now, anxiety, on the other hand, I saw first paper maybe 10 years ago, and it continues to get replicated. Anxiety is super high, like clinical levels of anxiety is super high in the spectrum population. And it tends, I just saw an article the other day where it tends to increase as a person ages, which is the inverse of what we see in the general population. So at any one time, one article I saw quoted 50% of individuals on the spectrum would qualify for an anxiety disorder diagnosis. This is astronomical. These numbers are way up there. And so I think all parents of kids on the spectrum should be aware that their child is at very high risk for anxiety and an anxiety disorder. The good news is, if there is good news here, is that anxiety disorders tend to be very treatable. It's the thing that we as psychologists and therapists know how to work with the best. There's a lot of great research out there in therapeutic techniques, which involve a lot of times looking at the source of the anxiety and also developing pretty standardized coping techniques and those kinds of things. So anxiety is very treatable, and but it's also very real. So parents need to take it seriously.
Well, at least there is a silver lining to that cloud.
I don't know how many of your listeners will see that silver lining, but I do want to say that there's hope and there's something to do. If your child is having problems, there is something to do.
Yeah. And that's what we really want to feel like as parents, is we want to feel like we can help and that we can do something. So that's great. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for being here today. The teen years have historically received a bad rap, and they still do. But I think you've given us some great takeaways that will allow parents to really support their kids. So I thank you wholeheartedly for that. It's been great talking to you.
Well, you're welcome. And it has been great talking to you as well.
Well, thank you so much. For those of you who would like to learn more about effectively supporting your child on the autism spectrum, be sure to check out Andrew's book, which I'll include in the show notes. Also, for our listeners who have a Torchlight account, be sure to log in and check out some of the eGuides, webinars, and tools related to the topics we've discussed here today, including eGuides such as developing friendships and social skills, bullying and cyberbullying, and preventing drug and alcohol abuse. Also, be sure to check out our upcoming 2019 webinars calendar, where we will be discussing some of the latest research and thinking around autism support. That's all for today. Thank you all very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast. Find this and other episodes on iTunes, Spreaker, and Podcast Go. If you're interested in bringing Torchlight Child or any of Torchlight's other caregiving products to your workplace, please contact info@torchlight.care. That's info@torchlight.care.